I want to shortly to introduce our speaker for tonight to you, those who are here and those who are participating online tonight. Guys, Stroumsa is Martin Buber, Professor Emeritus of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Professor Emeritus of the Study of the Abrahamic Religions and Emeritus Fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. He is a member of the Israel Academy of Science and Humanities and holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich. He received the Humboldt Research Award, the Leopold Lucas Prize, and the Rothschild Prize, and he is Chevalier de l'Ordre du Mérite in France. He is a very productive writer. He is author of 18 books and 150 articles, and editor and co-editor of 21 books. Among his recent publications are this book, so The Idea of Semitic Monotheism, The Rise and Fall of a Scholarly Myth, published 2021. Then also very new, The Crucible of Religion in Late Antiquity, 2021, and also recently The Religion as Intellectual Challenge in the Long 20th Century. He has published 2016 The Scriptural Universe of Ancient Christianity, 2015 The Making of the Abrahamic Religions in Late Antiquity, A New Science, The Discovery of Religion in the Age of Reason, 2010, and 2009, The End of Sacrifice, Religious Transformations of Late Antiquity. So I stop this now. I want for the German participants recommend a small book, which is in German, after I read so many English titles, which is are the lectures of him and his wife when they received the Leopold Lucas Prize of the University of Tübingen. And that has the title Eine dreifältige Schnur über Judentum, Christentum und Islam in Geschichte und Wissenschaft. Here is the cover. So after promoting your books, it's now up to you to speak to us with the theme, the study of religion and the spirit of Orientalism, cultural transformations and scholarly shifts. And I like to mention formally before you start that when you finish, then there will be discussion here with the audience on site, but as well online participants have the possibility to ask their questions via the chat function, and this will be sent to me so I can ask the question for them. So now it's up to you, and thank you that you are joining, and we are full of expectations.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Groshans. I was very keen of coming to Münster, and I looked forward very much to this. It turned out not to be possible. I'm very sorry about that. I apologize for all those who will have to listen to me on Zoom, and I'm starting now. Like all social institutions, religions constantly change, evolving and transforming themselves. Sometimes one can speak of brutal transformations and of religious revolutions. When one does that, the truism is obvious to all, but more often, the conatus of religions entails their more or less peaceful evolution. Now, while all religions have in their DNA a potential for radical transformation, they are instinctively more inclined towards conservatism, and the function of their hermeneutical systems, while permitting change when deemed necessary or unavoidable, consists essentially in slowing down the pace of such change and making sure it goes unnoticed or almost unnoticed. Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who won a Nobel Prize in economics, has shown that we all function with two parallel systems of thought, thinking fast and slow, as he entitled his book on the topic. Similarly, I propose we identify two alternate patterns of religious change, slow versus fast. Religion and society at large then are complementary motors, actors, and objects of change in history. In a permanent dialectical relationship with one another, religion and society are taking turns at initiating change, responding to it, modulating it, and transforming the direction, intensity, and even the very nature of this change. In a recently published book, the one that you just saw, The Idea of Semitic Monotheism, The Rise and Fall of a Scholarly Myth, I sought to understand some societal dimensions of the idea of Semitic monotheism, an idea coined by Ernest Renan in the mid-19th century and developed in European scholarship in the subsequent decades. The idea was interdependent with both new perceptions of Judaism and Islam and transformed attitude toward Jews and Muslims. Hence, I tried to highlight veiled connections between the history of religions, then a growing scholarly discipline, and some deep changes in European societies related to the secularization process. I shall present here a few preliminary reflections on this research, which I think bear directly on the topic of our conference from a particular but capital angle. It is an evidence which barely needs mentioning that since the early modern great discoveries, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, the pace of change has been faster than ever before. The contemporary entry into the digital age has transformed the world, indeed, is still transforming it in many ways, into what we have learned to call a global village, although a thoroughly polluted one, far from any idyllic or romantic imagination. With the Enlightenment in particular, Europe, and then many societies all around the world, have undergone a complex process of heightened secularization, a process jump-started by the Reformation. While secularization is a highly polyvalent term, it always refers to a shrinking of the status of established and organized religion in the public sphere, including personal law, the limitation of its political role, and the enhanced focus of the private and personal sphere as the main or legitimate locus of religion. It is clear then that the process of secularization has a deep impact on the nature of religion, involving far-reaching changes, first in its practice, but also in its doctrine, as well as in its self-perception. With those changes in religion, another, perhaps subtler, but no less significant phenomenon was initiated by the critique of religion at the time of the Enlightenment. The non-theological approach of Christianity, and by extension of Judaism and Islam, the other monotheistic religions best known in Europe, also permitted the growth of the modern study of religion and modeled anew the approach to religious phenomena. I wish to argue that a major paradigm shift in the very perception of monotheism, and in particular of Judaism and Islam occurred throughout the 19th century, and that this paradigm shift bears directly on the formation of modern scholarship on religion. Towards the end of the 19th century, the science of religion stood, unlike in our own days, at the forefront of knowledge, and its claims were so many combative statements which impacted on society at large. The broader public significance of a discipline, usually perceived today as arcane, is one of the themes I hope to showcase here. The modern study of religion developed throughout the 19th century up to the establishment, in its last third, of the first academic chairs, journals, and conferences exclusively devoted to the new discipline. To a great extent, it focused on the religious systems of newly discovered peoples throughout Asia, in the Americas, and in Africa, as well as those from the Mediterranean and Near Eastern antiquity, which were now analyzed thanks to new philological tools and the supporting evidence brought by archaeology. In this context, the understanding of polytheistic, or, as in the case of Buddhism, non-theistic systems, approached for the first time in a non-polemical fashion, sine ira et studio, played a central role. In medieval Christian societies, both in Byzantium and in the Latin West, there existed a single taxonomy of the world religions. For a full millennium, roughly from the 8th to the 18th century, Christian thinkers had perceived the world as divided between four main religious families: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the rest, also known as heathenism. As a rule, this fourfold taxonomy did not entail the existence of a triple alliance of sorts between the monotheistic religions. Rather, polemics remained the usual medium of communication between them. Christianity, or more precisely, its various Orthodox versions, was of course the only true religion, vera religio, in Augustine's terms, while Judaism and Islam were considered to be erroneous ones, false religiones, one upstream and one downstream of Christianity, as it were. From Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th century to John of Damascus in the 8th, patristic heresiologists could even present them, Judaism and Islam, as heresies of sorts, Judaism being the first heresy and Islam the last and worst one. In different ways, Jews and Muslims remain the enemies of the true faith, but as monotheists, Jews and Muslims alike were recognized to be akin in a deep sense to the Christians, despite the enormous difference between them in Christian perception. While Jews were generally tolerated and humiliated as children of the devil, John 8:44, in traditional Christian societies, Muslims typically remained the enemy without. In modern times, the discovery of new societies and their traditional cultures demanded that this classification be abandoned, as the sole category of heathenism was no longer adequate to interpret the great variety of religions in the world. When the old taxonomy was abandoned, the centuries-old family relationship, to use Wittgenstein's metaphor, between the three monotheistic religions became significantly weakened. When William Jones, speaking in 1786 at the recently founded Calcutta Asiatic Society, announced that he had discovered similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, he was launching a new classification of languages and peoples, which would fast become the main paradigm beyond linguistics for a number of disciplines, throughout the 19th century. Semites and Aryans now took the traditional place of the offspring of Shem and Japheth, two of Noah's three sons. To a great extent, the Semites were imagined through the model of the Hebrews and the Jews. Indeed, from the 1880s on, the newly coined word anti-Semitism never referred to anyone except the Jews, while the Greeks represented the focal model of the Aryans. Monotheism would now be often conceived as a characteristic of a postulated ancient Semitic religion, while polytheism would usually be identified as pertaining to the nature of the Aryan religion. This new paradigm gave the old taxonomy the coup de grâce. New categories had to be forged, and this was one of the main tasks of the new science of religion. A Europe whose identity was perceived as torn between the Semitic roots of its religion and the Aryan nature of its languages and ethnicities saw the emergence of a new and deep ambivalence towards monotheism. This ambivalence was echoing and amplifying those trends in the radical Enlightenment that had grown strongly critical of the established churches. The new European discovery of similarities between Sanskrit and almost all European languages led to the identification of families of languages and also of families of religions, in particular the Aryan and the Semitic religious families. Deducting religion and ethnicity from linguistics is, of course, a fallacy, a fact underlined towards the end of the 19th century by the French scholar Salomon Reynac in his long article Le Mirage Oriental, a fallacy which, as we know, would have dramatic consequences. A number of significant European intellectuals now started to identify European languages and people as belonging to the Indo-European, or Indo-Germanic in German parlance, or Aryan family. They were loath to consider their own religion, Christianity, as related in any significant way to Judaism and Islam, the main extant Semitic religions, and preferred to see in it a religious expression of the Aryan race. To be sure, one should not overstate the global importance of Pan-Aryanism and imagine that it represented the leading trend in 19th century European thought. The majority of their contemporaries did not take the most vociferous heralds of this kind of racialism seriously. To deduct the early nature of racialist thought patterns from its radical, murderous consequences in the 20th century would amount to teleological reasoning. Nevertheless, in the academic study of religion, the Aryan-Semite taxonomy did have a major formative role. Paradoxically or not, Christianity itself remained relatively peripheral to the development of the new discipline. It is always easier to develop the distance needed for an objective and critical approach towards the religions of others rather than towards one's own. Indeed, while the traditional reflection on religion has been the object of theology and philosophy, the modern study of religion grew mainly at the interface of philology, Oriental studies, and ethnology. The religion of biblical Israel stayed within the purview of theology, while post-biblical and rabbinic Judaism were usually considered to be of little interest, reflecting the religious decadence that in Christian perception had occurred among the Hebrews after the biblical prophets and certainly after Jesus, since Jesus. Moreover, the historical study of Christianity and the critical philological approach to the Bible in our period remained largely in the hands of liberal Protestant theologians. Catholics were still forbidden by ecclesiastical authorities to deal with higher biblical criticism. The study of Islam, on the other hand, continued to be mainly in the hands of Arabists, who for centuries had typically displayed a disparaging attitude to Muhammad, dubbed a false prophet, and to his religion. As a result, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam did not form part of the new discipline's core. My primary goal here is to appreciate the consequences of this fact on the study of monotheism, in particular on the scholarly approaches to Judaism and Islam, two religions that now came to be perceived as quite alien to Christian Europe. Attitudes to Judaism and to Islam, however, stayed strikingly different from one another, as Judaism was perceived as the more intimate enemy, the enemy within, as it were, while Islam remained essentially foreign, extraneous. Moreover, in most countries of Western Europe, there existed numerous old Jewish communities which were being emancipated in the 19th century. There were then very few Muslims and no Muslim community in those areas. The discrepancy also partly explains the difference and the intensity of attitudes towards Judaism and Islam. In contradistinction to the old abstract history of ideas, intellectual history seeks to understand ideas within their full social and political context. When dealing with approaches to religion in the 19th century, accelerated secularization, growing nationalism, and imperial colonialism provide the immediate context. The analysis of scholarly discourse on religion must reflect the new status of religion in societies that were undergoing intensive processes of secularization. On the one hand, with the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities, the working classes were learning to free themselves from ecclesiastical control, and the traditional or established churches were losing their customary grip on Western European societies. On the other hand, a number of powerful thinkers pursuing the radical Enlightenment's onslaught on traditional Christianity were in search of new forms of spirituality. From Hegel's Age of the Spirit to Auguste Comte's Religion of the Future, their proposals seduced many, such as Friedrich David Strauss in Germany or Edgar Quinet in France. The second half of the century saw important decline in the number of churchgoers, together with the growth of the historical and comparative study of religion. Expressions of religion were regressing from the public sphere to the private one. The Christian dimension of European identities, of course, was in no way disappearing. Rather, the semiotic range of Christianity moved as it was increasingly transformed from the expression of Europe's core religious identity to representing a central element of European cultural identity or cultural memory. This was perhaps nowhere as clearly manifest as in the case of the Bible in Protestant countries, where it became in the 19th century in its vernacular translations a core element of education and culture of what the Germans called Bildung. Even though Christianity did not always represent shared actual beliefs and practices, it certainly remained at the core of historical consciousness and national identity. This was what Hegel referred to as the transformation or Aufhebung of Christianity in the full-fledged Geist. Secularization alone, however, does not explain the transformation of the status of Christianity in European consciousness from representing Europe's religious capital to its cultural capital, to use a concept crafted by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Both the rapid growth of nationalism and the expansion of colonial conquests in the age of imperialism must be factored in. The growing feelings of European superiority versus Asian and African peoples and cultures would, in the second half of the century, in the heyday of colonialism, be expressed in a new key, that of scientific racism. The new expression of disparaging attitude to foreign peoples and their cultures would have an immediate, potent, and lasting impact on scholarly conceptions. Among others, Martin Bernal, focusing on the study of Greek antiquity, has shown how the categories forged in 19th century scholarship reflected racist ideas. One paradoxical and insidious consequence of this distanciation from Judaism and Islam led to a major fracture in European identity and to a new crisis of European consciousness, following that of the Enlightenment, so masterfully analyzed by Paul Hazard. The depth of this fracture, as well as its effect on the status of Judaism and Islam in the European mind, has yet to be fully measured. Before the Enlightenment, the Near East, then usually referred to simply as the East, was considered to be the soil of all human religious origins. All religions had come from the ancient Near East, both from Egypt to Babylonia, through the lands of the Bible. As Christianity was perceived essentially as the European religion par excellence, Judaism and Islam were, for the European mind, the two surviving religions from the ancient Near East. Now, however, they became perceived only as coming from the East of the West, or the West of the deep and true East, that of India and China. Judaism and Islam thus fell between Europe and India, between the two poles of Indo-European cultural and religious creativity. To be sure, scholars recognize that the geographical spread of Islam throughout the world was impressive, and that both Jews and Muslims believed in one God. Yet, all in all, racial prejudice against the Jews, distinct from the traditional religious anti-Semitism, and condescending attitudes to Islam and Islamic societies entailed a strong devaluation of both Judaism and Islam, and a clear preference for Indo-European religious systems and cultural traditions over Semitic religions and cultures. European Christians were thus contriving to escape the Jewish Near Eastern origins of their religion. The close relationship of Christianity with European culture, it was argued, did not deny its universal nature, and it was therefore Europe's duty to promote Christianity through Asia to Africa, along the model of its earlier conquests in the Americas. Intellectual perceptions of Judaism and Islam, moreover, are directly related to social attitudes towards Jews and Muslims in European societies, a point which there is surely no need to belabor. In the early stages of Jewish emancipation, a process that had started with the French Revolution, Jewish communities in Western European societies were being transformed very fast. Together with emancipation and less exclusion from society at large came new tensions. The traditional forms of Christian anti-Judaism, which of course had not disappeared, were reactivated, as it were, in a new racial key, and fresh forms of prejudice were formulated. In various ways, the Jews were now felt to be more alien than at any time previously. Their identity was perceived as an Asian one. In other words, the Jews did not really belong to Europe. Thus Herder and so many after him. At the same time, Islam was being identified as the religion of Europe's immediate and scored neighbor, the Ottoman Empire, and that of colonized people from the Maghreb to the Indian subcontinent and beyond. As a consequence, Muslims were often despised and hated. For generations, there had existed, of course, significant Muslim communities on European soil, mainly in the Balkans. In Southern European imagery, they were often pictured as peaceful traders. More often than not, however, they remained marginalized in Western European perception. Imperialism and colonialism in Africa, the Near East, and Southeast Asia could only strengthen negative attitudes toward Islam and Muslims and reactivate existing prejudices. Orientalist trends in art and literature, as we know, highlighted in the 19th century such negative attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. In the mid-19th century, the French historian and philosopher Edgar Quinet coined the phrase "la Renaissance orientale," by which he meant a new European scholarly interest in and cultural sensitivity for the civilizations of Asia. Since Quinet's days, European perceptions of the Orient have remained a highly loaded topic, as demonstrated by the fate of Edward Said's Orientalism, a book published more than a generation ago, which soon became a cult book. Over the years, since its publication, polemics around it, at times in stringent tones, seem to remain endemic. There is no need to rehash here either the important points he was making or the detailed criticism of its various shortcomings. One of the deplorable consequences of Said's book, however, is of direct import to our topic, as it derided the colossal effort made by many bright, studious, and courageous scholars. They succeeded in opening new vistas to whole civilizations far beyond the borders of Europe. Intellectual curiosity among these scholars seems to have been boundless. A number of excellent monographs on aspects of 19th century Orientalism have done much to highlight its rich and complex history, as well as the many links, both obvious, starting with linguistics demands, and implicit, between Orientalism and the study of religion. While the study of Islam and that of Judaism form part of the Orientalist enterprise, and I use this word without the usual pejorative connotations, they obviously also belong to the study of religion. Like Orientalism, the latter grew throughout the 19th century, eventually becoming a full-fledged scholarly discipline. How and when was the modern critical study of religion born? Among the branches of humanistic scholarship, the study of religion seems to have particularly suffered from a lack of reflexivity upon its own history. In the last generations, however, sophisticated histories of the history of religion have done much to remedy this sore state of affairs, shedding new light on the history of the modern study of religion. It is but natural that these books usually refocus on the second half of the 19th century, the period when the first university chairs and scholarly journals were established in a number of European countries. In countries of Protestant culture, in particular, the study of religion became established in theological faculties. One of the major consequences of this situation is that the study of religion long remained deeply embedded in theological conceptions, as Jonathan Z. Smith was able to show regarding the religions of late antiquity and the world of early Christianity. What is needed is a critical genealogy of scholarly discourse. In a way, such a genealogy would attempt to unveil the unconscious of the discipline. By unconscious, I refer to implicit hidden principles that dictate research and the development of the field. It is no accident that such principles usually remain unexpressed, in the field of religion perhaps more than anywhere else. If Freud was right in arguing that religion is particularly fraught with repression, Verdrängung, the same may also be true of its study. Focusing on the history of scholarship, then, I seek to epitomize the study of an absence. Why is it that 19th century scholarly religious scholarship neglected the comparative study of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, a form of study that it had inherited from a long tradition? It is true that 19th century historicism sought to see phenomena as rooted in their cultural and historical context, and to give each nation its due, as Ranke duly noted. Still, comparative scholarship blossomed in various fields in the last decades of the century at the acme of British imperial power. In a number of ways, the colonial enterprise fostered a comparative approach with the avowed view of claiming the supremacy of European culture over that of other civilizations. The inquiry also stands at the confluence of different disciplines blooming in our period, in particular the study of Islam on the one hand, together with Arabic, Turkic, and Iranian philology, and Jewish studies, or rather, as it was called at the time, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, on the other hand. Jewish scholars play a specific role in the emergence of the history of religion at the crossroads with Orientalism in the second half of the 19th century. This role reflects their particular status and self-perception, as well as a unique aspect of the discipline. By and large, among European scholars of religion, only the Jews did not identify as Christians, at least culturally. Jewish scholars sought at once, in different ways, to achieve various goals, not always compatible with one another. They sought to apply philological and historical methods to Jewish texts and documents which they considered unduly ignored or misunderstood by Christian scholars. Moreover, moved as they were by at once a sense of belonging to their own traditional Jewish culture and by their intense desire to become full-fledged members of society at large, they believed that as Orientals living in the West, they could offer a bridge of sorts between the cultures and languages of Asia and of Europe. The rise of Romanticism and of national movements contributed to the breakup of the integrative reflection on the three great monotheistic traditions we now call the Abrahamic religions. This breakup was finalized by the combined impact of a traditional contempt for Islam and a patronizing or worse attitude to contemporary Muslim societies. Side by side with this aversion to Islam, the new racial anti-Semitism was growing. At the time, the Jews of Europe were starting to leave the ghettos and enter Western European societies, a dramatic change of the old patterns of relationship between Christians and Jews during many centuries. With their new economic integration in societies at large, however, the Jews soon discovered, painfully, that this was not enough to earn them what Heine called an entrance ticket to European society, a ticket which only baptism could really provide. The Jews, as already mentioned, were perceived as stemming from the Orient and often considered as still belonging to it. It should be noted that Jews often embraced these Oriental roots with pride. This self-identification is reflected in the Orientalizing architecture of many 19th century synagogues, a style meant to allude to the mythical symbiosis or convivencia between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in Al-Andalus, medieval Islamic Spain. The scholarly study of Christianity, in particular early and late antique Christianity, which slowly sought to disengage itself from theology without ever fully succeeding in achieving this goal, represents a special case in the emerging comparative and historical study of religions. The appearance in the last 3 decades of the 19th century of the new concept of world religions broke the traditional family relationship of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as it insisted in seeing Christianity to be a full-fledged universalist religion, while Islam was granted this status only grudgingly, and Judaism rejected into the category of racially and ethnically determined religions. The history of scholarship represents more than a list of achievements of individual scholars. It is also made of scholarly institutions, in the framework of which free research and intellectual breakthroughs can happen. Such scholarly institutions include universities, but also theological seminaries, scientific academies, scholarly journals, conferences, and publishing venues and companies. In contradistinction to early modernity, when scholarship remained essentially the personal adventure of highly gifted and idiosyncratic individuals, from the 19th century on, research has mainly been carried on within universities. It is indeed the dialectical interaction between individual thinking and the institutionalized systems of knowledge that transforms disciplines. One cannot really understand intellectual discourse and scholarly practices without constant reference to their cultural, religious, and ideological background. Since their birth in the 17th century, the modern humanistic disciplines, like the natural sciences, have been fascinated by comparison. The comparison between languages, cultures, legal systems, scientific traditions, mythologies, and societies, however, has always reflected an effort in detecting differences as much as in seeking similarities between them. These early modern humanistic disciplines were the offspring of the puzzlement generated by the new cultures and societies revealed by the great discoveries. The comparative element gathered momentum in the 19th century, starting with linguistics under the impact of Franz Bopp's seminal studies on the grammar of the Indo-European languages, and reached its zenith towards the end of that century. Comparison lies at the center of the non-theological study of religion since the 18th century. Ever present and indispensable, comparison is always highly problematic as a method. It is rarely innocent. It is a constant exercise, one that is at the core of experimental investigation. What do we do when we compare? The answers depends, of course, upon one's goal, viewpoint, and culture. Anthropologists in particular have reflected much on the question of comparison between societies, both those broadly similar and those highly different from one another. Contemporary historiography of our discipline typically focuses on Protestant countries in the second half of the 19th century. Philippe Bourgeot, for instance, puts his finger on a climate of secularization in Protestant countries in the 1870s, while Hans Kippenberg follows the traditional emphasis on Protestant scholarship. Until the early 20th century, the Catholic hierarchy was still fiercely fighting the critical methods in the study of the scriptures, and Catholic theological faculties remained, by and large, unwilling to study religious phenomena and history in a modern, non-traditional way. Despite various daring attempts, such as those of the Dominicans of the École Biblique in Jerusalem since the days of Father Marie-Joseph Lagrange, Catholic scholars were prohibited from practicing higher criticism until Vatican II. More precisely, it was within Protestant theological faculties in Germany that the new critical approach to the scriptures was born, and that the progressive theological liberalization was most conspicuous, permitting the study of non-Christian religions, past and present. Fresh scholarly biblical hermeneutics eventually opened the way to the comparative of religious texts from both the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, a trend famously illustrated in the Göttingen Religionsgeschichtliche Schule in the last decade of the 19th century. These ancient texts were now understood as reflecting the background, or Sitz im Leben, of the religious ideas expressed in the books of the Old and New Testament. The obvious and massive cleft between Protestant and Catholic biblical scholarship, however, is also responsible for a common error of perception, when it is too often assumed that the 19th century study of religion is essentially a Protestant affair. The combined evidence showing the major importance and transmission of knowledge between different European countries and the crucial significance for the science of religion of ethnological studies, coming at the time mainly from Catholic missionaries, clearly discards such a misperception. It is as a complex combination of elements coming from different cultural and intellectual traditions that the modern study of religion emerged. In the trajectory of modern scholarship on religion, a number of significant shifts in systems of knowledge brought to the reconstruction of central cognitive structures. The formation and restructuring of concepts and methods modifies fields of study, sometimes profoundly transforming them. Such fields are ultimately related to the construction of the self, in particular when they deal directly with religious identities. In a time of profound and extensive secularization of European societies, the historical and comparative study of religions, which is a particularly delicate and interdisciplinary field of scholarship, has had a significant impact on both the transmission of knowledge and the formation of European identities. What was true in the 19th century remains true today, as we witness throughout Europe bursts of Islamophobia and an animated, enduring, often strident, and sometimes violent public discussion about the ethnic, cultural, and religious implications of the massive immigration from Muslim countries, coming together with a worrisome renewal, under various garbs, of a Judeophobia we naively thought was on the waning. Even the largely post-Christian Europe of the 21st century, indeed, does not seem to be quite done with its old obsessions about Muslims and Jews. I thank you very much.
Yeah, we thank you for this rich and exciting lecture, I would say, because you took us in the history of research about religion in the 19th century, and you showed the shifts which have been taken place during this dealing with the topic of religion in Europe, especially as you emphasized dominantly in Protestant Christianity or theology, or within that framework, and how the perception of Judaism and Islam changed in this time with all these methodological problems you mentioned. But I don't want to repeat what you said. I actually would like to open the floor now for questions here in the audience. And online, please online, write your questions or statements in the chat, and I will receive it on the tablet. Who wants to start? Actually, if I may, then I would like to ask for, as a starter, a first question. I was wondering a bit if in this, say, historical research in the 19th century on the religions of the Near and Middle East, if the Christian communities in this area have been considered by the European scholars because they also, I'm not a historian, but I would think that they probably have been overlooked. So I have with the impression that what was understood by Christianity was a dramatic reduction to a certain type of Christianity in Europe, ignoring the presence, say, of Christianity in the Middle East, especially, perhaps.
May I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is a very good question. I've been trying to check it actually recently, and here is what I can say on one foot. The origins of Orientalism in the 17th century came from European scholars, which certainly considered themselves to be very Christians, usually enlightened, of the enlightened kind, Protestant, Anglican, and Catholic, and they studied the languages of Eastern Christianity: Syriac, Ge'ez, Ethiopian, Armenian, Arabic, and so on. And went also, I'm thinking of people in the 17th century, like the Oxford, the great scholar Pocock, went to the Middle East to try to bring Eastern Christians to the true faith, which is their own, so either to Anglicanism or to Protestantism and so on. But they were singularly interested in them. What happened later in the 19th century, again, there was a phenomenon of missionaries sent to the Near East to convert the Muslims, which was done with not too much success, of course. At some point to Palestine to convert the Jews. The Anglicans, bishops, and some were converted, and to take care of the Eastern Christians. But the reflection on Eastern Christians was not prominent in the study of Orientalism. It was a subfield, usually among Catholics, then became mainly more important among Catholics than among Protestants, and completely disconnected from their Sitzim Leben, which was within Islamic societies. this is the most striking phenomenon. And for instance, the modern study of Islamic and Jewish philosophy begins in the mid-19th century. Of Christian philosophical texts written in Arabic, only in the early 20th century, and only by very few Christian, usually Catholic Arabists. So that's my answer. They've been disconnected from their Sitzimleben.
My impression was that as nowadays in Protestant theology, still the Middle East Christianity is ignored. If one makes a taxography of Christianity, I was wondering if this was already in the 19th century, more or less the case. The Catholic theology had always interest because of the churches in the East in union with Rome, so they had connections. But there is a question in the back, EuARe Sofko from Croatia, a philosopher. He will ask you something.
Thank you very much for a very interesting interpretation and presentation of three different religions. What I miss in your presentation is idea of progress. It started with Christianity, with Occidental form of interpretation, and it is in some sense connected with the science, that the biggest progress in this secular Christianity connected with the life world, concrete life world, is connection to the science. And in some sense, when I have a lot of Muslim friends, they told me that they miss this connection with the science, maybe only in Iran in some sense, but all other Islamic countries, they have not this connection. Okay, we could say it was connection between Islamic culture and ancient culture during the Baghdad period, early period in Islam, but in later, in some sense in Cordoba in Spain. But Islam has own parts. Jewish tradition is closed in the national history and movement, and Christianity became Catholicos in the sense universal, just because it's connected with the freedom of research, and of course with the science.
I mean, I felt, you hear me, yes? You hear me now. Okay, I felt that I had mentioned too many things in my lecture in 45 minutes. So you call me to mention also science. You're right. Science is extremely important in 19th century scholarship and thought. Think only of Hegel, of course. The problem is that progress and science, progress in religion ends with Christianity. So when, and Christianity is the acme of the history of religions, and Islam coming later actually cannot be accommodated by the history of the Geist in Hegel. I'll mention about science, I'll mention the other name of a major scholar of religion of the 19th century, Ernest Renan. Renan is a believer. He became a historian of religion when he stopped believing in the Catholic Christianity of his youth, when he was a student in a seminary. He said, by the way, that had he been a Protestant, he would have been able to remain a Christian, he thought, thinking of David Strauss maybe. But Renan believes in progress. And he says the history, the religion of the future will be science. And the best kind of science in the humanities that we have is the history of religion that will be at once mythology, philosophy, and religion. So for him, the history of religion encompasses the whole humanistic sciences. And he believes that we believe in the idea of progress, and this is why understanding the history of religions permits us to integrate them all into our belief in future in the religion of the future. I mentioned Auguste Comte, again, obviously a belief in progress. And you're right, for all these people, since science was by now, at the time, a European phenomenon, Islamic societies, all other societies, but in particular Islamic societies which are around Europe, show only intellectual decay and therefore are barely worth of our interest. I mean, there's a very deep Islamophobia, intellectual Islamophobia throughout the century. There's a physical Judeophobia, a racial Judeophobia. The Islamophobia is not at all racial, because it's not anti-Semitism. It includes the Persians in some sense, although they, being Aryans, show the best of Islam, and the Turks. The Turkic peoples have been Islamicized and therefore are also more or less degenerate intellectually and spiritually. So, yeah.
Please. That's now a question. Perhaps you say your name and where you come from.
My name is Charles Christian. I come from Protestant Theological University, Netherlands. My question is that current study of religion, at least in India, suggests that Orientalism was a co-creation of powerful colonialists and powerful among those powerful among the subjects, powerful natives. So one writer, Andrew Nicholson, even suggests that the powerful subjects gave the Orientalists what they wanted to maintain their own status in the hierarchy of power. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I'm very willing to say very simply that to a great extent, this is true. But I want to call attention to what I was saying, that Orientalism in the 19th century, if you want, Orientalism has been denigrated to a great extent justly, but also to some extent unjustly. Orientalism starts in the 19th century as the study of Oriental languages, literatures, arts, and cultures. And this is done more often than not by people who are in good faith, intellectually curious of discovering the beauties of languages, of literatures, of cultures and arts throughout the world. And this is forgotten when one describes Orientalism today only as something permitting the manipulation of the colonized peoples. So I want you to remember that Orientalism in the 19th century is also a very important, very decent intellectual pursuit of trying to understand other societies. Let me put it that way. I do not know whether, to such an extent, other civilizations have ever been interested in seriously understanding foreign cultures and languages. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Introduce yourself.
I'm Matthijs Lambries from the Catholic University of Leuven. We met already each other in the past, but now I have a question about your comparative approach. You said it is very difficult, it's ideological, and my question would be, is it possible? What are we comparing when we see the diversity in Judaism, the diversity in Islam, and the diversity in Christianity? There is not one Judaism, there's not one Islam, and there's not one Christianity. Will our comparison not be very superficial? And is it possible to do that, let us say, just by one person?
Well, thank you very much. Let me say the following. For 30 years, I taught in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University and was very interested in the history of the discipline. I was mainly focusing on early Christianity and the history of Christian mysticism, but I was interested in theoretical and historical comparative topics too. It is only in my 31st year of teaching, I was then 61, that I decided to give an introduction to the, I didn't call them Abrahamic religions, I call them introduction to the monotheistic religions. And I tried, most of we don't ask our students their religions, but most of them were obviously Jews, or some Muslims, some Christians, and it was clear to me that the Jews came to my class to learn something about Christianity and Islam. They thought that, Judaism, they know, and my first pedagogical goal was to show them how they misunderstand Judaism when they don't learn it in the comparative perspective of Christianity and Islam. I don't know if I succeeded. It's not for me to say, of course, but I noticed that they kept coming back from week to week to my class. So now, what comparison, I will only provide a very short answer because this is a huge question, of course. Comparison can be a number of very different things. You compare in order to grade, to say this one is the best, the second one, the third one, and so on. You compare similarities, or you can compare in the search for differences. This is where I'm mainly interested in comparing. When I compare Judaism's, Christianity's, and Islam's, if you want, in the plural, what I want to see is there at some point, where is it that they are fundamentally different? And when I understand, or I think I understand something, where I get an insight, then I think I get an insight about the religion itself. For instance, think about history and time. There are, as you know, a very broad number of reflections on time, history, eschatology, among Jewish texts, among Christian texts, and among Muslim texts, and so on, Buddhist texts, if you want, and so forth. But if you find something that appears only in Jewish texts about time, about eschatology, about cosmogony or whatever, and not in Christian and Islamic texts, maybe that will, or in Christian texts or in Islamic texts, maybe that will teach us something about what constitutes the essence or part of the essence of the identity. When I I came to Jerusalem to study when I was 18. I grew up in France, came to Jerusalem. My Hebrew was then extremely mediocre, of course. And a year or two after I came, I happened to meet at his home Gershom Scholem, who was then retired, a very distinguished professor of the history of Jewish mysticism. And I was at the time mainly interested in the history of Judaism, and I asked him, Professor Scholem, I'm interested in what makes the unity of Judaism throughout the ages. And he smiled at me and answered, when I was your age, I was interested in the same question, and then asked myself, what creates the unity between all books of the Hebrew Bible? And it's very hard to answer even this question. So I agree, but let's put it that way. For the comparative theologian, or when you're doing interfaith discussion, you're looking for similarities between religions. When you are doing history as a historian of religion, you are mainly interested in the differences. It is hard. It is certainly not something that a single person can do, but it is. When I first came to Oxford, I was invited to establish a new chair, and I thought it was a very good challenge for me in the last years of my career, and I tried my best. And I also co-edited the Oxford Handbook of the Abrahamic Religions. We asked about 35 scholars to deal with the aspect of their own scholarship, but to deal with it in some way, in a comparative way, in some fashion, in a comparative way. And they usually, to some extent, succeeded, and that's the beginning of a new, I wouldn't say field, but a new discussion, a new discourse in the study of religion. I think I should stop here. We could, next time we meet in person, we could continue the discussion ad infinitum. Thank you.
I have now a comment online from an online participant who thanks very much for the interesting and inspiring presentation. But then there is also a question from an online participant, from Pavlo Smytsnik from Lviv in the Ukraine, who asks, you mentioned the influence of Western colonial history and lately ideologies on Orientalism. Can you say something about the opposite movement? That is, the Oriental, in particular Jewish and Islamic approaches to Christianity. Did they have a similar evolution? For example, how did the Holocaust influence the Jewish understanding of Christianity, or how the US military adventures influenced the way Christianity is studied in the Middle East? So this relates now not to 19th century, obviously, in the end of these questions, but perhaps the first one is more 19th century. The other, obviously, are more to nowadays times.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. This is I'll go on. This is a very good question, which I cannot again answer fully, but I will say something. The concept of Abrahamic religion is surprisingly perhaps a new concept. From my perspective, I think, I'm not sure, I cannot demonstrate that, but I think it was coined by Lebanese Christian students of the professor of Islamic mysticism at the Collège de France, Louis Massignon, who between the two world wars mainly spoke about and wrote about the three prayers of Abraham, the Christian, the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim prayer. These Maronite priests coming to Paris, I mean, they were of French education. They come, and that comes back to your question earlier. They come to Paris to study Islam, and they go back to Lebanon, and they realize that Louis Massignon has given them a new tool to deal with their Muslim contemporaries, Muslim neighbors, Muslim friends, instead of what they had been trained and they used throughout the centuries. Christians, Muslims, and Jews mainly used polemics when dealing with one another. You know, our religion is better than yours. Sometimes we cannot say it very clearly when we are in the minority, but we nonetheless believe that. Both Jews and Muslims always thought that Christianity is barely a monotheistic religion. You know, okay. You say you are monotheists. Okay, so we will behave as if we believed you, but they don't really. Christians and Jews basically always thought that Muhammad was the wrong kind of prophet, a false prophet or whatever. And Christians and Muslims always thought that Judaism is a religion of the past. It's a religion of a people, and it's not like us, a true, namely a world religion. So that was throughout the years. Now the question is, does in the 20th century, so I mentioned the Lebanese priests, Catholic priests coming back to Lebanon and using a new language to approach their Islamic Muslim compatriots, and the Jews after the Shoah. Do the Jews after the Shoah deal with Christianity differently than they did before? I think so. I think that today, actually, Jews basically have understood that they too, most of them, including what I used to tell my students in Jerusalem, you realize that you too culturally are Christians, and it wakes them up usually. Yes, I think that sometimes in good ways, a kind of attempt to understand Christianity and Islam. So I'm speaking mainly about Israel because I'm a Jew living in Israel, but also in America, certainly Jews are interested in the history of Christianity in a non-polemical way, and in interfaith, of course. And I think that also in Israel there is a very serious study of Islam. And despite all the tensions with Arabic societies and countries around us, and which is seriously changing very fast, actually, I think that there is a very open-mindedness towards Islam as a religion and as a phenomenon. In many ways, much more easily tolerated than in European universities. I mean, in at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and in other universities in Israel, Muslim women very often cover their head, and I've never felt that it creates any kind of problem. Okay, I think that's beyond the topic of my lecture, so I should stop here.
Yeah, I have one more question from my side. You mentioned only in a short remark about, say, Christian anti-Semitism, but more or less at the end of the lecture. You showed with this looking on the, say, transformations in the perceptions of the religions to each other in the 19th century. That you concentrated on the relation of the religions to each other in your presentation. But your colleague Moshe Zimmermann, once also in a Lukas, with the Lukas Prize speech in Tübingen, he differentiated between, say, a political anti-Semitism and the Christian anti-Semitism. And I found this, perhaps because I'm a Christian, a good distinction, because it's not putting everything, say, in the understanding of anti-Semitism only to the religion of Christianity, but looking also on other factors, say, more in the political arena. And you mentioned racism and so on, which may be not only rooted in a religion, but perhaps has other roots. So what do you think about this distinction Moshe Zimmermann 2002 in his Lukas Prize lecture put forward?
Actually, I've not read his lecture. I know Zimmermann very well, of course. I think I tried to make a distinction between traditional Christian anti-Judaism that I called even, I wrote once, I said at least once, anti-Judaism and not anti-Semitism, because it is really a adversus Judeos polemics, and it is usually not racial at all, except at some point after the Reconquista in Spain, there is an obsession about the limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. I mean, Jews who have converted to Christianity are being checked and they cannot reach the higher echelons of society. So this is where racial anti-Semitism starts. Until then, a converted Jew is a Christian, full stop, everywhere, in all conceptions of Christianity. So I think certainly from the 19th century on, a bit earlier maybe, I mean, if you read Voltaire is a who hates Christianity, of course, as historical Christianity, hates the Jews in a rational fashion, completely irrational and hard to understand within the perimeter of his own thought, actually. But in the 19th century, because of the kind of I spoke about the mistake in the syllogism, because there are languages which are Aryan and Semitic, therefore there are also peoples and religions which are Aryan or Semitic. From now on, this is when racialism starts. I think it's more, I will read Zimmermann's lecture, but I think it's more than political. It's racial, basically.
Political as term to indifference to religious. It was not only political in the sense of power politics. You know,
I certainly agree.
Yeah. Okay. Here's from a question from my colleague in Münster, Per Schmidt-Leuke, who has the chair for religious studies in the Faculty of Protestant Theology. Only to say that this is still the case. But it's a new invention to have independent religious studies, at least in the faculty in Münster.
Yes,
please.
Professor Stroumsa, thanks for your lecture. I would like to learn a bit more how you understand the methodological implications or consequences of the Orientalism debate. I mean, not of Orientalism as a kind of historical fact or observation, but what are the implications of the debates about Orientalism? And the background of my question is that you emphasized at one point in your presentation that religious studies gradually emancipated itself, and also the history of religions, from its theological roots, right? And a part of this process of emancipating religious studies and history of religion and comparative religion from theological roots was that they were claiming that theological studies of other religions are always biased. And what we need is then a kind of neutral, objective approach, because this would be the only scientific approach. And then you have the label science of religion. But Orientalism, I mean, the debate that was triggered by Edward Said's book demonstrated that this kind of neutrality and objectivity of religious studies scholars is an illusion. That every scholar is a child of his or her time and society, and whatever kinds of social dynamics and interests are at work. Yeah? Now, if that is correct, what would be the implication? Would that mean that religious studies scholars should try even harder to get rid of their own presuppositions, yeah, or to bracket them as phenomenologists were demanding? Or would the conclusion be that every scholar should become more open and self-conscious of their own ideological presuppositions, yeah, and theological presuppositions in a broader sense, so that these presuppositions can be controlled in the impact which they have on religious studies and can become subject to criticism. So I would like to hear from you, what is your understanding of the implications of the Orientalism debate?
Well, thank you very much. You've asked again I've been blessed here with a number of very important questions. It seems that this will be the last, because we have to end now, is a very good question. I hope to be in Tübingen at some point in the near future and will continue orally. But I would say in Münster, but I will say this. You've answered it. Your last comments that scholars should become more conscious of their own presuppositions is what is needed. And you have to spell them out. And you have to spell them out. I mean, we didn't have to wait for Said to understand the problems. Dilthey already mentioned more than a century ago that there is no such thing as complete objectivism in the humane sciences. Yes, so we have to, every time when we start a class or a course or a book, you have to say where you stand. It is necessary, and then you have to try to bracket on as much as possible what you've done. I think that's how I've done. It's never perfect, but it has one good attitude, one good result, that it reminds us of our personal and intellectual limitations. And I think that's part of the education we have to give to our students, that we, like them, are not, I mean, there's no such thing as ex cathedra in a totally single objective way. So we need to keep also historians of religions like me, who are not in principle interested in interfaith studies, although I prefer people from different faiths to speak with one another than to fight one another. Also us, we have to do dialogue, inter-religious and intercultural dialogue all the time. That's it. That's what I have to say in a sentence.
Thank you very much. You had now at the end a kind of statement for intellectual modesty, but we received rich reflections from you, not modest reflections, rich reflections, and we are really inspired now by what you told us in the lecture, but also now in the discussion. Thank you very much, and greetings to your wife. Perhaps she is already waiting for the tea or the lunch, wherever you exactly are in this time. And thank you very much that you have been with us in this digital form. Thank you very much.
It was my privilege. Thank you.